Hey, welcome to church this morning. It's been a cold weekend. Apparently that affects wiring in a building. It also, we've had some stuff going on this morning. But you know what? Jesus is good, and we get to learn from Jesus today, and I'm excited about that. And so today we're actually starting a series called The Emotions of Jesus, and we're going to explore the emotional world of Jesus and various moments where Jesus actually demonstrates emotion. And it's fascinating because in our culture, emotion, it's a really powerful word because depending on your generation and depending on sort of your life experiences, emotion brings up lots of different kinds of things. And in the ancient world, I want to give you a bit of a tour of the ancient world. So in the ancient Roman world, which is the world that kind of Jesus and the apostles and everybody were embedded in, we often talk about that reality of the first century. The philosophy around emotions is fascinating because it really kind of centered on the hierarchy of the family system and the governing system. So as you know, the men were the very, very patriarchal kind of leaders in every setting you can imagine. And so ethical men who had virtue, according to Roman sources, were the men who had the quality of self-control. So self-control becomes this sort of masculine trait in the ancient world, and it's really fascinating because if you look at some of the things that men did during those years, you probably would say that doesn't seem too restrained, that doesn't seem too controlled, right? But for them, this idea that you could become a man who had little to no emotion and who expressed little to no emotion was the ideal. It meant that you had mastered yourself and therefore were virtuous and on your way to being virtuous like the gods. And so they had this idea that then as a result, ladies, warning again, women in the ancient world were considered uncontrolled. Yeah. So we have this world where it's patriarchal, men are self-controlled, women are considered emotional and unable to self-regulate, right? All these things. And in that setting, the Romans said, therefore women have no virtue. We can't trust them with much besides mothering, right? And so this is the world of Jesus and the apostles. Judaism was a bit more nuanced than that in the ancient world, but it still had some real gaps about these issues. And so what we're looking at when we look at Jesus is actually a figure for the ancient people who would have been despised in a lot of ways. Like, he doesn't seem that self-controlled. He doesn't seem that helpful. He doesn't seem like a real man, so to speak. And maybe you've heard messages that kind of feel similar when we talk about emotion in modern day. Maybe you grew up in a situation where you kind of had this system or values that you were born into where expressing your emotion was discouraged and self-control and quietness even was your posture. There's a lot of different experiences I know in this room. It's fascinating too, like in kind of the last several years, expressing emotion and ideas, this has become more in vogue, more popular, right? Like, you do you, speak your truth. Oh, we're going to have a trigger warning because this is a hard thing. And sometimes those are necessary, right? Like sometimes I'll even give a warning like, hey, just so you know, something we're going to talk about is hard today, and if you need to go, I'll give permission during those moments, right? So I don't think all of that's bad, but I think when it comes to the world of emotions, it sometimes really gets confusing. Like, how should I actually hold these feelings? What kind of validity do I give to them? And that's why we're going to look at Jesus and his posture. And so in this series, we're going to look at 5 different emotional characteristics of Jesus. And today, we are going to talk about compassion. Today, we're going to notice the ways in which Jesus felt compassion, expressed compassion, and how that really was one of the things that drew people in. You know, it's interesting because churches want to do this. You want to do this, right? We all want to do this well. Like compassion's a good emotion that we, you know, as Christians or people who are exploring faith, maybe you thought, yeah, faith might help me like express compassion better or justice or peace, right? We want to be those kind of people intuitively. Sometimes as churches, we do a pretty kind of job at expressing this desire for compassion. Here's a church sign that I saw one time. I love a good church sign. We love hurting people. Oh, we just love those hurting people, and we just love hurting people, right? So we don't know if we're like a bunch of He-Man types or whatever, like ready to crush things, or if we're just like the nicest people in the world. Yeah, context matters, especially when we read the Bible, by the way. And so I want to just look at Jesus for a few minutes with you and just see, like, what does compassion look like in the life of Jesus? And in fact, we know this is hard. We know that compassion often requires us to step outside of our normal social kind of spheres, for instance, right? Like we have to actually move towards people that maybe naturally we're not inclined to move towards. To have a table that's more inclusive, more diverse, more different than us. So compassion is hard, and especially when we aren't naturally wanting to move towards people that are different than us. And so here's what I want to wrestle with today as we look at this first emotion of Jesus. I want to think about this. Compassion, not disgust, is Jesus' posture towards outsiders. What's yours? Compassion, not disgust, is Jesus' posture towards outsiders. What's yours? So today, that's what we're going to do. We're going to wrestle with that. We're going to really look at Jesus and say, okay, like if Jesus is the epitome of what compassion looks like in human life, and if I want my life to look something like his, what will compassion require of me? And how does my impulse towards rejection to other people come into play? So, we are going to be in a passage of Scripture. This is Mark chapter 1. And it's early in Mark's gospel. And one thing to know about Mark's gospel is it's one of the gospels that doesn't have a Christmas story. It actually starts with John the Baptist is preparing the way for Jesus. And it's like every scene in Mark's gospel is very strategically placed. And he's constantly trying to get us to the next thing, right? Over and over, he'll use the word, immediately this thing happened. And it doesn't mean immediately like right after the last thing. And it means immediately like, stay with me. We're moving forward in this narrative, right? And it's all moving towards Jesus' self-giving love through crucifixion. And of course, the Gospel of Mark ends really sort of mysteriously in a sense because you get the empty tomb and people just sitting there going, huh? What's this mean, right? And so Mark chapter 1, we already will see Jesus has been baptized, he's been tempted, and now he's going to step into a situation with a man who has leprosy. And this is starting in verse 40 of the chapter. It says this. A man with leprosy came and knelt in front of Jesus, begging to be healed. If you are willing, you can heal me and make me clean, he said. And here's the key verse. Moved with compassion. Moved with compassion. Jesus reached out and touched him. I'm going to pause here for a minute. Jesus reaches out and touches him. Now, if you've been in church for a while, you probably know a little bit about this skin disease called leprosy. Leprosy is a word that sort of is a catch-all for sort of diseases that basically cause lesions that are not healing, and you start to sort of like really, you can lose pieces of you. It just gets really, really bad at its worst. And someone in the room who's in medical school will correct that for me later. But it's bad, right? It's bad. And in the ancient world, they didn't know how to deal with it. They didn't know how contagious, but they felt that it was contagious. They often, in Jewish communities, they would kind of had this idea that it was maybe a punishment from God, that you were outside, you were unworthy, you weren't good enough, you didn't belong. But people were just afraid. And so for Jesus to even be in proximity of someone with this disease is already a boundary-crossing sort of situation. And simply to engage him. And now, what's he do? He actually will heal him through touch. Now, here's what's fascinating. We have other stories where Jesus can I'll just say the word and they'll be healed. But the author here, the author of the gospel, wants us to know that there was physical contact between Jesus and this skin condition. There was physical touch required for healing to happen. He's willing to cross over into space that is, for so many, ugly, disgusting, outside the box, outside the boundaries, outside of anything that could possibly be worthy of attention. And so, Jesus reached out and touched him. He said, I am willing, be healed. Instantly, the leprosy disappeared, and the man was healed. Then Jesus sent him on his way with a stern warning. Don't tell anyone about this. Instead, go to the priest and let him examine you. Take along the offering required in the law of Moses for those who have been healed of leprosy. This will be a public testimony that you have been cleansed. And so here we have, Jesus is like, you don't need to tell anyone about this. I don't need publicity. This is early in the story. He wants to sort of manage his publicity. He's trying to do PR here. I don't need everyone knowing about me right away, because if they know about me right away, I won't be able to do some of the things I want to do. And so he sort of often will say, hey, you don't got to tell. But that doesn't really work strategically, right? Crowds follow him anyway. People come to know about him anyway. The word spreads. And the other part of this is Jesus is more concerned about the guy being publicly declared clean again. Jesus is like, it's fine. You don't need to go talk about this. Just go do what you have to do to be human in your community again. How many of us want that for someone we love? How many of us want that maybe for ourselves and in situations? Maybe you're in a situation where I don't feel accepted here for whatever reason. And if there was something I could do to feel accepted in that space, I would. And Jesus says, go do the thing that gives you access to your community again. And then in verse 45, it says, but the man went and spread the word, proclaiming to everyone what had happened. As a result, large crowds soon surrounded Jesus, and he couldn't publicly enter a town anywhere. He had to stay out in the secluded places, but people from everywhere kept coming to him. So Jesus will continue to draw crowds because he's compassionate. People are hearing about this amazing thing. Jesus is doing something no one would do. And it draws out people who maybe are also outsiders, also don't feel like they fit in different ways. And I can imagine if I were in that situation in the first century and I heard, hey, this guy Jesus actually touched that guy with leprosy and the man was healed. I wonder if he would be that kind towards me. And it also probably drew out their empathy for people like that. It changed the value system that they were going to step into. Because compassion, not disgust, is Jesus' posture towards outsiders. And he's not going to let what society has deemed outside of the box run his program, run his ministry. He's going to do what he knows reveals God's heart for every human being. So first thought here is Jesus is compassionate when our instinct is disgust. You know, I saw an example of this in 2013. Now we're an evangelical kind of Baptist church, right? Like we're Protestant people here. But I remember the way the world was moved in 2013 when a photo or two started circulating of Pope Francis, he was new-ish at that time, where a man with a skin condition was being blessed. I have a picture from the reports, I think, on the screen coming, maybe, yeah. And while we're not from the same tradition by any stretch, you look at this picture and you hear this story and you say, I can start to imagine the impact of being there in that moment, or even just simply imagining that moment. Now, the difference here, of course, is that when Jesus touches the man is actually completely healed. But why did these images make such an impact throughout the world? This story was covered in all kinds of ways. The reason was because they saw a man who represented faith, Christianity, religion, and they saw a man and they said, I can't believe that the most powerful person in that religious tradition is choosing to step across a boundary towards someone. When this man was later interviewed, he actually said that, of course that wasn't set up or anything like that. And he said, there's no way that the Pope even knew. There's no way he even knew whether I was contagious or not. He just chose love. He just chose compassion in that moment, trusting that that's what Jesus might do. There's a book about this tension between compassion and disgust. Richard Beck is a philosopher and sociologist, and he says this, and there's some technical language in here, but I think it just helps us understand the intensity of this tension. He said, disgust creates our experience of otherness. More specifically, disgust and love function in tension as a boundary psychology. In other words, because of those experiences, because there's love, but there's, I don't know if I can go that far with my love, right? There's this invisible boundary that we build that's hard to push through. Consequently, love is impossible if disgust or associated emotions such as contempt is operative. This seems obvious at its genocidal worst, the eradication of monsters and scapegoats. However, psychological research has shown that socio-moral fissures, in other words, gaps, right? These social moral gaps exist in every human heart. Thus, if the Christian is to embrace the call to hospitality, the dynamics of otherness must be mastered at a deep psychological level. Miroslav Volf, who's another author and theologian, calls this the will to embrace. The choice, the desire, the openness to say, I'm going to choose to embrace when it is not my default in this situation. Otherness doesn't define value. Otherness doesn't define inherent worth. Otherness doesn't get to define whether this person is good enough for God versus me because I'm clearly good, right? Like otherness doesn't, and in fact, culture wars don't get to define that either. I'm sick of culture wars. Anyone just sick of it? Like Christians often just play by the rules of the media, the rules of the blogosphere, and I'm just going to tell you, don't waste your time in the middle of a this or that polarity, because you know what happens when you're in a this or that polarity? You end up somewhere that's not like Jesus, because Jesus says, I see this, I'm going to do this. So often we've allowed the world around us to dictate how we posture ourselves in a world that's very confused, very broken. And we've said, okay, so here's what we're going to do. We're just going to fix society. We're just going to Christianize the world around us by voting the right way, having the big opinions about who should be where. I almost said who should be in the White House, but I'm in the wrong place. It's very weird, disconcerting, and awkward how many Canadians care more about American politics. Anyway, it's very, very weird thing for me. If we put all of our eggs in that basket, and look, those are all decisions we're all going to have to make, and I'm not judging you if you have ideas about that stuff. I'm simply saying this, that if that's how we want to sort of get to a place where compassion somehow is in the world, let me tell you something. Every time we've seen really Christianized nations, the compassion thing just hasn't really worked out well. It just hasn't. You know where compassion works out well? When a ragtag group of people who love God, love Jesus, want to make a difference in their neighborhood, want to make a difference in their block, who want to make a difference at work, when those people say, you know what? I'm not very comfortable, but I'm going to make a choice to be kind to this person who rubs me all kinds of ways and they aren't good. That's compassion. That's Jesus, right? Because here's the other thing I want to talk about today, that compassion dignifies and disgust dehumanizes. And to dehumanize is always anti-Christian. It's always, I'll call it this, it's anti-Christ, right? Like it's anti the way of Jesus to say those people matter less than these people. Or to think it, or to feel it, or to enact it, even if you're like, oh, they matter, but you know what Jesus knows? He's like, I'm just going to go touch them. Compassion dignifies. Disgust dehumanizes. And we're going to have our opinions about how to enact this stuff and how to walk this out. But here's the deal. Each and every day, you have an opportunity to say, I'm going to become more like Jesus, and I'm going to choose to have a heart that is wired towards kindness, wired towards empathy, wired towards compassion. And this doesn't mean when you're walking down the street, you just got a bunch of dollar bills, and, well, we don't have dollar bills here anymore, right? A bunch of toonies and loonies, right? And you're just like, here's a coin, right? Like, I'm not saying that. Like, use wisdom. What I'm saying is that if you are fundamentally turned off by someone, start praying for that person and see what happens, because Jesus commands us to pray even for our enemies. So the person that you think is outside, doesn't fit, Jesus says, pray for that person. Compassion is about dignifying image bearers of God. They matter, they're loved, and they may do things that are wrong, but they're loved. They're invited. They get kindness, not attitude. So what breaks your heart? I heard a sermon that I was listening to in my podcast ear, and this was a big question that was asked, and I thought that actually fits today. Like, what breaks your heart? Like, what's the thing that you would say, when I'm sitting in this, and I think about people who are outside of my sort of comfort zone, outside of the boundaries the society has painted or the church has painted at times, like, what breaks my heart? And does it break Jesus's too? And here's the thing, like, if you can answer both of those questions in tandem, you're going to get closer and closer to becoming the kind of person who touches leprosy rather than running from it. Now, of course, I'm speaking metaphorically here, right? I'm not saying that you should walk into a hospital and start touching I'm not saying any of that. I'm simply saying that when you're wired for compassion, you'll go places you didn't expect to go. You'll be with people you didn't expect to be with. You'll see an opportunity and you'll actually say, you know what? Wisely, but compassionately, what if I took a little risk here? What if I was known in this person's life as someone who said, I see you, when they're unseen, when they're unloved? Maybe we'd be getting closer to the things that break Jesus' heart in our world. You know, there's a movie that many of us maybe have seen called The Help. Maybe you remember this about the nannies and workers in the home in the 1960s, African-American women who were stepping into really, really hard work environments with white families who were often rude at best, abusive, and just awful. And there's this scene and this phrase that comes up over and over again because the nanny, Abilene, is charged with taking care of this young girl. And the parents are awful. The parents are dehumanizing, not just the nanny, but they're terrible to their own daughter. They're abusive in all kinds of ways. And in those hard moments, Abilene, this awesome nanny, will pull her aside and she simply would say, you was kind, you was smart, you was important. You was kind, you was smart, you was important. You don't even have to be the privileged one in the dynamic to be compassionate. You simply have to decide that you're compassionate. You simply have to decide that the person in front of you is worthy of dignity and love and respect. And who then would God invite you to be declaring? You're kind, smart, important, you matter. Who would Jesus invite you to say, you know what, I struggle with this person at work or this people group or these people, I struggle there and I want to recognize that. I want to actually repent of that impulse to say, I couldn't possibly, I can't, and then to say, you know what, but Jesus did. And Jesus still does. And it's through you and I that he does it the most. His compassion is what we are invited to embody. He felt compassion. He wasn't a stoic who just said, oh, the right thing to do because I'm a noble person is to go be He felt it. He experienced it. He said, there's nothing better in this moment than to let my emotion of compassion hit me in the gut and then to step towards someone. What if that was you? What if that was me? Right? This is hard. But if we're called to be followers of Jesus, and if we're wanting to even take our emotional experiences and hold them with Jesus in a way that is healthy and humanizing and life-giving, what if we just simply decided we're going to try to feel like Jesus feels and step out courageously with wisdom and with care? Because that's what Jesus does, and that's who Jesus is inviting you and me to become. Can I pray for you? Yeah, let's pray. So Jesus, I know that a series like this and a topic like this particular one, this is hard. It's hard because we're always going to be tempted to see other people as less than us, less worthy, less important. Or perhaps we struggle with fear. Maybe there's other things that make compassion hard. And God, here's what's so beautiful. Your compassion extends to each person in this room and beyond it. And so even when we're struggling, like, God, I don't know if I could become compassionate like you are. You're with us in that. And you're saying, it's okay. Let me show you the next step. Let me invite you into the next possibility. And Lord, I know that people in this room have various backgrounds with you, various circumstances. And God, I just know that whether we've been Christians for a long time, maybe we're new to faith, maybe we're exploring the idea of faith, that you are inviting us to have a resource in you that the Romans couldn't have dreamt up, that no culture or society could dream up. Because the resource that we have is you in our hearts and minds, filling our lives with your Spirit, God. We, in you, can be enabled to become more compassionate, more kind than we ever could without you. So Jesus, rewire our hearts and minds to be more and more like you. Thank you for your goodness. It's in your name I pray. Amen.